I opened the door expecting a package. Instead, I got a cash-filled envelope and the truth that would destroy my entire marriage. My name is Sloane, and I need to tell you about the day my perfect life shattered in the time it takes to make coffee. 5 minutes. That's all it took for me to discover my husband had been living multiple lives, and I was just one of them. I was married to Donovan for 6 years. He was a successful plastic surgeon in Denver, and we lived in a beautiful house in Cherry Creek, the kind of place people post on Instagram with hashtags about blessed lives and dream homes. I'd given up my photography career to be what he always called the wife of a successful doctor. Looking back, that phrase should have been my first red flag. But I was in love, or at least I thought I was. Donovan traveled constantly. Medical conferences in different cities, surgeries that required overnight stays, endless hospital shifts that kept him away for days at a time. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was dedicated to his career, and I was proud of him. That Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Donovan kissed my forehead and rushed out the door, saying he'd forgotten his wallet at the office and would be back in 5 minutes. 2 minutes later, the doorbell rang. The elderly woman standing on my porch looked to be in her mid-70s, with white hair pulled into a neat bun and tired but kind eyes. She was clutching a thick manila envelope, and her hands were shaking. When she asked if I was Sloane, my confusion must have shown on my face. Then she said the words that would haunt me forever. She told me she was Evelyn, Donovan's grandmother. My heart stopped. Donovan had always told me both his grandparents died before we met, but this woman was very much alive, standing on my doorstep, and she looked terrified. What she said next, I need you to hear, because this story gets darker than I ever imagined possible, and I'm going to need someone to walk through it with me. If you want to make sure you hear how this all ends, and trust me, you'll want to know, you can follow along with the stories shared here. That way, you won't miss what happened next, because what that envelope contained, and what Evelyn whispered to me in those desperate few minutes before Donovan returned, would lead me to discover something so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that even now I sometimes wake up wondering if it was all a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was my real life, and it was about to get a whole lot worse before it got better. The envelope Evelyn pressed into my hands was heavy, and I could feel the thickness of cash inside, even through the paper. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the street, like she was afraid Donovan might appear at any second. I asked her what was happening, my voice barely working. The woman looked at me with such pity that my stomach dropped before she even spoke. She told me Donovan had another wife. Not an ex-wife, another current wife. In Boulder, a woman named Caroline who'd been married to him for 9 years and had 2 young sons. The world tilted sideways. I tried to tell her it didn't make sense, that she must be confused, but Evelyn grabbed my hand with surprising strength. She said Donovan divided his week between us. What I thought were hospital shifts and medical conferences were actually nights spent with his other family. She said he was addicted to this lifestyle, that he collected families like trophies. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me he'd done this before me, before Caroline. There had been others, and men like him became dangerous when they realized they'd been caught. Evelyn handed me a business card and told me to call the lawyer whose name was printed on it. She said Caroline had hired a private investigator last month after discovering my existence. They'd been gathering evidence, but I needed to leave immediately, before Donovan suspected I knew anything. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. A beautiful blonde woman holding 2 small boys, maybe 5 and 7 years old. Behind them, prominently displayed on the living room wall, was an enormous wedding photo. Donovan in a tuxedo, smiling at the camera, his arm around Caroline in her white dress. The pose was identical to our wedding photo hanging in my own living room. Evelyn's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She explained that Donovan married each woman legally, using falsified documents and altered birth dates. He used variations of his name, took advantage of Colorado's laws that didn't require marriage announcements. Caroline's marriage certificate was real. So was mine, which meant my husband was guilty of bigamy, a federal crime. But right then, Evelyn said, the crime didn't matter. My safety mattered. She begged me not to sleep in that house that night, not to confront Donovan, not to give him any indication that I knew. She said the envelope contained $25,000 in cash, enough for me to disappear and start over. That's when I heard it. the sound of Donovan's car pulling into the garage. Evelyn's face went pale. She whispered that he couldn't see her there, that it would put both of us in danger. She made me promise I wouldn't stay in the house that night. Then she ran through the side yard and disappeared through the back gate. I barely had time to shove the envelope under the sofa cushion before Donovan walked through the door. Waving his wallet and complaining cheerfully about how he'd accidentally locked it in his glove compartment, he was smiling, relaxed, completely normal, like he hadn't just destroyed my entire world without even knowing it. I forced myself to smile back. My face felt like plastic. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears so loudly I was sure he must hear it too. But Donovan just kissed my cheek and asked what I wanted for dinner, and I somehow managed to suggest ordering pizza while my mind screamed that nothing about this man was real. That evening was the longest of my life. I sat across from him at our dining table, watching him eat and talk about his day at the clinic, and every word felt like a lie. Every smile felt like a mask. I kept thinking about Caroline in Boulder, about whether she was sitting at her own dining table right now with Donovan's children, believing her husband was working a late shift in Denver. I told Donovan I had a headache and went to the guest bedroom. I lay there in the dark, listening to him move around the house, hearing the shower run, the TV turn on in our bedroom. At midnight, I heard his breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep. At 2 a.m, I moved. I grabbed the envelope from under the sofa cushion, my jewelry box, our important documents from the file cabinet, and my laptop. I packed one suitcase with clothes and essentials, working in complete darkness, every creak of the floorboards making me freeze in terror. I left my wedding ring on the bathroom counter. I couldn't bring myself to wear it another second. The drive to the nearest hotel felt surreal. The streets were empty, and I kept checking my rearview mirror, irrationally convinced Donovan would somehow know I'd left and come after me. When I finally locked the hotel room door behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Stacks of $100 bills. $25,000, just like Evelyn had said. And underneath the money, a handwritten note in elderly cursive. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you sooner. Please be safe. Call the lawyer today. E." I pulled out the business card. Marcus Reeves, family law attorney, Boulder, Colorado. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely dial the number. It was 3 a.m, but when the voicemail picked up, I left a message anyway. I told him Evelyn had sent me, that I was Donovan's wife in Denver, and that I needed help. Then I pulled out my phone and did what I should have done years ago. I started searching for my husband's name online, really searching. Not just the casual vanity searches I'd done before. I added different middle names, different spellings, different cities, and that's when I found her. Not Caroline. I found the third wife. Her name was Natalie. She lived in Colorado Springs. And her Facebook profile, which she'd made public, featured a wedding photo from 4 years ago. Donovan stood beside her in the same tuxedo he'd worn for my wedding. For Caroline's wedding, with the same practiced smile. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. When I came back, my phone was ringing. Despite the early hour, Marcus Reeves, the attorney, was calling me back. Marcus Reeves had been waiting for my call. That's what he told me when I answered the phone at 3:30 a.m, my voice still hoarse from being sick. He said Caroline had mentioned there might be a second wife, but they'd discovered I existed only recently. What he said next made me sit down hard on the hotel bed. He told me Caroline had hired a private investigator 2 months ago after finding a receipt in Donovan's car from a restaurant in Denver on a night he'd claimed to be in surgery. The investigator had uncovered not just me, but Natalie in Colorado Springs as well. 3 wives, 3 separate lives, all running simultaneously. Marcus said he'd been practicing family law for 23 years and had never seen bigamy executed so systematically. I told him about the Facebook profile I'd just found, about Natalie's wedding photo. Marcus went quiet for a moment, then asked if I could meet him and Caroline that morning. He said we needed to coordinate our approach, that the 3 of us working together would be crucial for building a case strong enough to ensure Donovan faced real consequences. The idea of meeting my husband's other wife made my skin crawl, but I agreed. What choice did I have? Marcus gave me the address of his office and told me to bring any financial documents I had access to, especially bank statements and tax returns. After we hung up, I couldn't sleep. I sat in that hotel room as the sun came up, going through my laptop and photographing every document I could find. Our joint savings account statements, mortgage papers, credit card bills. I uploaded everything to a cloud drive, terrified that Donovan might somehow remotely wipe my computer. Around 6 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from Donovan. He was asking where I was, saying he'd woken up and found me gone. His messages progressed from confused to concerned to irritated. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I turned off my phone's location services and blocked him from tracking my devices. The drive to Boulder felt endless. I kept rehearsing what I'd say to Caroline, this woman who'd been married to my husband longer than I had, who'd given him children while I'd been planning to start trying for a baby next year. The thought made me nauseous again. Marcus's office was in a modest brick building near downtown Boulder. When I walked into the conference room, Caroline was already there. She looked exactly like her photo. Blonde, pretty, with exhausted eyes that probably mirrored my own. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then she stood up and, to my complete surprise, hugged me. She whispered that she was sorry, that she knew this wasn't my fault, that we were both victims of the same predator. When she pulled back, I could see she'd been crying. She told me her boys kept asking where Daddy was, and she didn't know how to explain that the father they loved was a criminal who'd been lying to everyone. Marcus spread files across the conference table like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. He showed us the investigator's report, a thick document that detailed Donovan's movements over the past 8 weeks. The man had crafted an intricate schedule that rotated him between 3 households, using hospital shifts, medical conferences, and emergency surgeries as cover stories. Mondays and Tuesdays, he was with Caroline and the boys in Boulder. Wednesdays and Thursdays, he stayed at the hospital, but was actually with me in Denver. Fridays through Sunday mornings, he was with Natalie in Colorado Springs. Sunday afternoons and evenings, he worked an actual shift at Denver General, which gave him legitimate cover and probably helped him maintain his sanity by having some truth in his life. But here's what made me feel physically sick. The investigator had found evidence of a 4th woman, a 24-year-old medical student named Jenna, who believed she was Donovan's girlfriend. He'd been dating her for 8 months, promising they'd get married after she finished her residency. He was already preparing the next victim. Caroline's hands were shaking as she showed me texts from Natalie. The 3rd wife had been contacted by the investigator just days before Evelyn showed up at my door. Natalie had been devastated, but she'd agreed to cooperate. She was supposed to join us at the meeting, but Marcus explained she'd had a panic attack that morning and couldn't make herself come. She'd sent all her documentation by secure email instead. I asked how Donovan had managed to marry 3 people legally. Marcus explained that Colorado doesn't require marriage license applications to be published publicly, and Donovan had used that loophole expertly. He'd applied for licenses in different counties, used slightly different versions of his name. Donovan Marcus Hayes for Caroline, Donovan M. Hayes for me, D. Marcus Hayes for Natalie. He'd falsified his birth date by a few years on different applications, listed his parents with varying names, claimed to be divorced rather than widowed or never married. Each marriage was technically legal in isolation. The crime was in the accumulation, in the deliberate deception, and the maintenance of multiple simultaneous unions. Then, Marcus showed us the financial records that the investigator had obtained, and that's when the betrayal cut even deeper. Donovan had been systematically draining money from all 3 of us. The joint savings account I thought contained $40,000. It had $300 in it. He'd transferred money out gradually, in amounts small enough that I hadn't noticed. Caroline's account was the same story. Natalie, who worked as a dental hygienist and had been putting away money for her daughter's college fund, had been cleaned out completely. He'd used our money to maintain his lifestyle, to pay for the apartments and houses, the gifts for Jenna, the conference trips that were actually vacations. He'd been living off our combined incomes while convincing each of us that his medical practice made him wealthy enough to support us all. I asked the question that was burning in my mind. I asked Marcus how Evelyn had found out, how Donovan's grandmother had discovered the truth and decided to help us instead of protecting her grandson. Caroline answered. She said Evelyn had come to her house one morning last month, unannounced, after Donovan had accidentally left his phone there. The phone he used for me and Natalie, not the one Caroline knew about. Evelyn had been staying with Caroline and the boys for a few days while Donovan was supposedly at a conference. The phone had buzzed with a text from me, something casual about dinner plans. Evelyn had seen it and confronted Donovan immediately when he came back. He'd tried to lie to his own grandmother, but Evelyn wasn't fooled. She'd raised him, knew his patterns. She'd demanded the truth, and when he'd refused, she'd started her own investigation. She'd gone through his documents while he was in the shower, found different IDs, different insurance cards with different wives listed as beneficiaries. Evelyn had been horrified. According to Caroline, the old woman had cried for 2 days, then decided she couldn't let it continue. She'd contacted Caroline's investigator, provided information, and had been the one to suggest the cash envelope plan for getting me out safely. Marcus pulled out another folder and told us what we needed to do next. We needed to go to the police together, file a formal complaint, and provide all the evidence we'd gathered. He warned us that bigamy cases were complex and that Donovan would likely hire an expensive attorney who'd try to claim this was consensual polyamory rather than fraud. That's when Caroline said something that changed everything. She told us that Donovan's medical license was up for renewal in 3 weeks. If we could get the case filed and get him arrested before that renewal, he'd lose his license automatically due to the criminal charges. Without his medical career, he'd lose everything. We looked at each other, Caroline and I, two strangers bound by betrayal, and we both nodded. Marcus made a call to a detective he knew who specialized in fraud cases. As we were preparing to leave for the police station, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. I'd forgotten I'd turned it back on. The message was from Donovan, and his tone had shifted from irritated to worried. He said he'd called the hospitals, thinking I might have been in an accident. He said he loved me and needed to know I was safe. I played the message for Caroline. She played one from her phone that had come in at almost the same time. Donovan telling her he loved her, that he'd be home Tuesday night, that he couldn't wait to see the boys. Marcus looked at both of us and said something I'll never forget. He said men like Donovan weren't incapable of love. They were incapable of fidelity. They loved the image they created, the power of maintaining separate worlds. To Donovan, we weren't people. We were territories he'd conquered and controlled. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated his grandmother's conscience, and he'd never imagined his 3 wives would unite instead of turning on each other. We walked into the Denver Police Department headquarters at 11 that morning. The detective Marcus had called met us in the lobby, a woman named Detective Sarah Chen who specialized in domestic fraud cases. When we told her we were 3 wives of the same man and we wanted to file charges for bigamy, her eyes widened. Then she led us to an interview room and told us to start from the beginning. By the end of that day, we'd given statements, handed over evidence, and watched Detective Chen's expression grow more shocked with each revelation. She told us this was the most elaborate bigamy case she'd encountered in her 15-year career, but what she said next made my blood run cold. She asked if any of us had significant life insurance policies. When Caroline mentioned that Donovan had insisted she get a $2 million policy last year, with him as the sole beneficiary, Detective Chen's jaw tightened. She said we needed to consider that Donovan might have been planning something more permanent than divorce, that the pattern of draining our finances, the collection of policies, the increasing number of wives, it suggested escalation. I realized then just how close I might have come to being more than a victim of fraud. I realized I might have been in actual danger. Detective Chen told us we needed to act normal. That was the hardest instruction I'd ever received. Pretend everything was fine while knowing my entire marriage was a criminal enterprise. She explained that if Donovan suspected we'd gone to the police, he might flee or destroy evidence. We needed him to believe his world was still intact while we built an airtight case around him. Caroline and I exchanged looks across that police station table. How were we supposed to go back to our lives and smile at a man who'd been systematically defrauding us for years? But Detective Chen insisted it was necessary. She said we had enough for an arrest, but she wanted more. She wanted financial records, communications, everything that would guarantee Donovan couldn't slip through some legal loophole with an expensive attorney. So I went back. Not to the house. I couldn't stomach that. But I started responding to Donovan's increasingly frantic texts. I told him I'd gotten food poisoning and had checked into a hotel to avoid keeping him up all night. I said I'd be home Friday evening. He responded immediately with concern and relief, telling me to rest and that he'd pick up my favorite soup from the place downtown. The normalcy of his response made my skin crawl. This man could switch between families like changing channels on a television. He'd perfected the art of compartmentalization to a degree that seemed almost inhuman. That Thursday afternoon, I met with Carolyn and Natalie for the first time as a trio. Natalie was younger than both of us, maybe late 20s, with dark, curly hair and eyes that looked like she hadn't slept in days. She worked as a dental hygienist and had a 10-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. Donovan had promised to adopt her daughter after they'd been married for a year. The girl called him Dad. Natalie told us her story in a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, her voice breaking multiple times. She'd met Donovan 3 years ago when he'd come to her dental office for a cleaning. He'd been charming, attentive, and had pursued her persistently. She'd been a single mother struggling to make ends meet, and suddenly here was this successful doctor who wanted to take care of her and her daughter. She said Donovan was with them Friday through Sunday, claiming he worked at Denver General during the week and needed to be close to the hospital for emergencies. He'd rented her a nice apartment, paid for her daughter's private school, took them on weekend trips. She'd felt like she'd finally found stability after years of barely surviving. Now she'd discovered the apartment was paid for with money drained from her own savings account. The private school tuition came from funds she'd set aside for her daughter's future. Donovan hadn't been providing for them. He'd been stealing from Natalie and using her own money to buy her affection. Caroline shared that she'd gone through the same financial manipulation. Donovan had convinced her to put him on all her accounts for emergencies, then had systematically transferred money out. The house in Boulder that she'd thought was jointly owned, mortgaged to the maximum with payments months behind, she'd been on the verge of foreclosure without even knowing it. My situation was identical. The beautiful Cherry Creek house I'd been so proud of, rented with the lease in my name only and payments coming from my trust fund that my parents had set up for me. Donovan had convinced me to give him access to help manage my finances. He'd been draining it for 6 years. Detective Chen had asked us to try to get Donovan to talk about his other lives without revealing we knew about them. It seemed impossible, but Caroline had an idea. She said Donovan got sloppy when he was tired or had been drinking. She suggested we each try to catch him in moments when his guard might be down. Friday night, I went back to the house. Donovan was there waiting with flowers, soup, and what looked like genuine concern. He touched my forehead to check for fever, asked about my symptoms, played the role of the caring doctor husband perfectly. I wondered how many times he'd performed this exact scene for Caroline or Natalie. Over dinner, I took Detective Chen's advice and started asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. Casual things like why he never let me come to hospital events. He said it was because they were boring medical stuff that would make me uncomfortable. When I pressed gently, mentioning I'd love to meet his colleagues, something flickered in his eyes. Just for a second, before he smiled and said he'd take me to the next fundraiser. Then I made a calculated risk. I told him I'd been thinking about us having a baby, that maybe we should start trying soon. I watched his face carefully as I said it. What I saw made my stomach turn. For just a fraction of a second, there was panic. Pure, undisguised panic. Then it was gone, replaced by his warm smile. He said we should wait until after his busy season at the practice, maybe start trying next year. But I'd seen it. The fear of another complication, another life that would make his juggling act even harder. He didn't want a baby with me. He probably didn't want the 2 he already had with Caroline. We were collections, not families. I excused myself to the bathroom and texted Detective Chen what I'd observed. She responded immediately, telling me I'd done well and to keep pushing gently for information about his schedule. When I came back, I asked Donovan about his upcoming week. He told me about surgeries on Monday and Tuesday, an overnight shift Wednesday, and a conference in Boulder Thursday through Sunday. My heart stopped at the word Boulder, but I kept my face neutral and said I'd miss him. He pulled me close and kissed my forehead, and I had to fight every instinct not to pull away. This man had 2 sons in Boulder he'd be sleeping next to this weekend, while I sat here believing he was at a medical conference. The level of deception required for that kind of double life was staggering. That night, after Donovan fell asleep, I went through his home office. Detective Chen had given me a small USB drive to copy any files I could access. I found his computer unlocked. He'd gotten careless, comfortable in his belief that I suspected nothing. The files I found were damning. Spreadsheets tracking his schedule between 3 households, documents with 3 different variations of his name, insurance policies on all 3 of us, each listing him as the sole beneficiary. The policies totaled over $4 million. But what made my hands shake was the folder labeled Exit Strategies. Inside were research files on states without extradition treaties, information about transferring medical licenses internationally, and searches for countries where bigamy laws were loosely enforced. Donovan had been planning an endgame. The question was whether that endgame involved disappearing with our money or something worse. I copied everything to the USB drive, cleared the computer's history, and went back to bed. I lay there in the dark next to a man I no longer recognized, listening to him breathe, and realized I'd been sleeping next to a stranger for 6 years. Saturday morning, Donovan left for his conference. I watched him pack his bag, kiss me goodbye, and drive away toward Boulder, where Caroline and his sons were waiting. As soon as his car disappeared, I called Detective Chen and told her about the exit strategy files. She told me to get out of the house immediately. She said they were moving up the arrest timeline. The evidence of flight risk combined with the life insurance policies created a picture of someone planning something catastrophic. I packed my things for the second time in a week and checked into a different hotel. Then I called Caroline and Natalie on a 3-way call that Detective Chen had set up on a secure line. We shared what we'd each discovered, and the picture that emerged was terrifying. Donovan had been preparing to vanish, but $4 million in life insurance couldn't be collected if he just disappeared. It could only be collected if we died. Detective Chen called an emergency meeting Sunday morning at the police station. When Caroline, Natalie, and I arrived, there were 2 other detectives in the room. A financial crime specialist named Detective Gordon, and someone from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit, which seemed extreme until they explained why they'd been called in. The exit strategy files I'd found weren't just about Donovan running away. They contained research on accidental death scenarios, house fires, carbon monoxide poisoning, car accidents on mountain roads. He'd been reading about ways to stage deaths that would trigger insurance payouts without raising suspicion. Agent Morrison from the FBI told us that what started as a bigamy investigation had become a potential attempted murder case. He said Donovan fit the profile of a certain type of family annihilator, men who built elaborate double lives, accumulated debts and complications, then eliminated their families rather than face the consequences of their exposure. Caroline started crying. She kept saying that her boys were with him right now, that they were in Boulder with a man who might have been researching how to kill them. Detective Chen assured her they had officers watching the Boulder house, that Donovan was under surveillance and wouldn't be able to hurt anyone. But the damage was already done. We'd all been living with a predator, sleeping next to someone who might have been calculating the most efficient way to eliminate us. Detective Gordon spread out financial documents across the table and showed us the full scope of Donovan's fraud. He'd taken out credit cards in all our names without our knowledge. My credit score, which I'd always maintained carefully, had been destroyed by maxed out cards I didn't know existed. Caroline and Natalie's finances were in similar shambles. But here's what the investigators had discovered that none of us knew. Donovan wasn't even a fully licensed plastic surgeon. His medical degree was real, but his specialty certification had been revoked 3 years ago after multiple malpractice complaints. He'd been practicing with an expired license, which explained why he'd been so adamant about not having us meet his colleagues or come to hospital events. The surgeries he claimed to be performing, most of them didn't exist. Some were real procedures he assisted with, but wasn't the primary surgeon for. Many were complete fabrications. The conference he was supposedly attending right now in Boulder. There was no medical conference scheduled in Colorado this weekend. Agent Morrison explained that Donovan was living a house of cards existence, each lie requiring 3 more lies to sustain it. The medical career lie, the 3 marriages, the financial fraud, all of it was collapsing, and he likely knew it. Men like him didn't go quietly. They either ran or they burned everything down. That's when Detective Chen told us the plan. They were going to arrest Donovan Monday morning at the medical clinic where he still maintained an office. They wanted to take him somewhere public, surrounded by colleagues, where he'd be humiliated and unable to create a scene or flee. But they needed us to maintain our normal communication with him until then, to give no indication we knew what was coming. I asked what would happen to the medical student Jenna, who believed she was his girlfriend. Agent Morrison said they'd already contacted her and warned her. She'd been devastated, but had agreed to help the investigation. She'd given them access to texts and emails that showed Donovan had been promising her a future while researching her financial background and her father's substantial wealth. Jenna hadn't been the next wife. She'd been the next mark in an escalating pattern of targeting wealthier victims. Natalie asked the question I think we'd all been afraid to voice. She asked if we were in immediate danger, if Donovan might realize we'd discovered everything and come after us. Detective Chen didn't sugarcoat it. She said, until he was in custody, we should all stay in secure locations with people who knew where we were. She assigned a patrol car to drive by each of our locations every few hours. That Sunday was the longest day of my life. I stayed in my hotel room, jumping at every sound in the hallway, convinced Donovan would somehow figure out what was happening and find me. Caroline texted from her mother's house where she'd taken the boys, telling them their father had to work all weekend. Natalie was with her sister, her daughter confused about why they weren't home. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. Donovan. I let it go to voicemail, my hands shaking too badly to answer. When I listened to the message, his voice was tense. He said the conference had been incredible, that he'd learned new techniques, that he missed me and couldn't wait to see me when he got back Monday night. Every word was a lie. There was no conference. He'd spent the weekend in Boulder with Caroline and the boys, and now he was calling me to maintain the fiction while probably preparing to drive to Colorado Springs to spend Sunday evening with Natalie before his Monday morning clinic hours. I forwarded the voicemail to Detective Chen. She responded immediately, telling me they'd traced the call. Donovan had placed it from a gas station just outside Colorado Springs. He was following his usual pattern, completing his rotation through his 3 households. Caroline called me crying an hour later. She said Donovan had just left her house, had kissed the boys goodnight, and told them he'd see them Tuesday after work. He'd played board games with them, helped them with homework, been the perfect father. She said she'd watched him interact with their sons, knowing he'd been researching ways to kill them, and she didn't know how to process that level of betrayal. Neither did I. None of us did. That night, lying awake in yet another hotel room, I thought about all the small moments I'd dismissed over the years, the times Donovan had discouraged me from making close friends in Denver, saying he wanted me all to himself, the way he'd convinced me to move away from my family in California, claiming the Denver opportunity was too good to pass up, how he'd slowly isolated me, making me dependent on him financially and emotionally. He'd done the same to Caroline and Natalie. We'd each been carefully selected, groomed, and isolated. Caroline had been a young nurse with a troubled family she was happy to distance herself from. Natalie had been a struggling single mother desperate for stability. I'd been a trust fund kid with strained family relationships after my father's affair had destroyed my parents' marriage. We'd all been vulnerable in different ways, and Donovan had identified those vulnerabilities like a predator selecting prey. Detective Chen had explained that men like Donovan often had antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. They lacked empathy, but could mimic it perfectly. They understood emotions intellectually and used that understanding to manipulate, but they didn't feel the way normal people felt. To Donovan, we weren't people with inner lives and feelings that mattered. We were resources to be exploited, problems to be managed, and eventually obstacles to be eliminated when we were no longer useful. Monday morning arrived. I woke at 5, unable to sleep. Detective Chen had texted that the arrest was scheduled for 9 a.m. when Donovan arrived at his clinic. She'd asked if any of us wanted to be there to witness it. Caroline said no. She couldn't face him. Natalie said the same, but I said yes. I needed to see it. I needed to watch him lose control of his carefully constructed world. At 8:30, I was sitting in Detective Chen's unmarked car across the street from the medical building where Donovan's practice was located. 2 other police cars were parked nearby, plus Agent Morrison's FBI vehicle. We watched doctors and nurses arriving for their shifts, completely unaware of what was about to happen. At 8:55, Donovan's silver BMW pulled into his reserved parking spot. I watched him get out, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, carrying his leather briefcase. He looked every inch the successful surgeon, confident and composed. He had no idea his world was about to end. Detective Chen spoke into her radio. The officers moved into position. Donovan was halfway across the parking lot when they intercepted him. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw his face when Detective Chen identified herself and told him he was under arrest for bigamy, fraud, and conspiracy. I saw the shock, then the anger, then something calculating pass across his features. He was already working on his defense, already figuring angles. Then Detective Chen said something else, probably reading his rights, and Donovan's expression changed completely. He looked across the parking lot, scanning the area, and for one terrible moment, his eyes landed on the car where I was sitting. Our eyes met through the windshield. 50 yards away, handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists, my husband of 6 years looked directly at me, and he smiled. Not a warm smile, not an apologetic smile. A cold, knowing smile that said he still believed he could talk his way out of this, that he still thought he was the smartest person in any room. That smile told me everything I needed to know about who Donovan really was. Detective Chen put him in the back of her police car as his colleagues from the clinic gathered in shocked clusters, watching. One woman, probably his receptionist, had her hands over her mouth. A doctor in scrubs was on his phone, likely calling the clinic director. Donovan's carefully maintained professional reputation was crumbling in real time. As the police car pulled away, Agent Morrison walked over to where I was sitting. He told me it was over, that Donovan was in custody, that we were safe now. But I felt anything but safe. I felt like I'd been living with a ghost for 6 years, married to a man who'd never actually existed. The arrest made local news by noon. Prominent Denver surgeon arrested for bigamy and fraud ran on every station. By evening, it had gone national. 3 wives, $4 million in life insurance policies, research on staging accidental deaths. It was the kind of story that gripped people because it could happen to anyone. My phone exploded with calls from my parents, old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted to know if I was okay, if it was really true, how I hadn't known. I turned my phone off after the 50th call and sat in my hotel room watching the news coverage with a surreal sense of detachment. They showed Donovan's photo, his professional headshot where he looked trustworthy and competent. They showed the clinic where he'd been arrested. One station had already found Caroline's house in Boulder and was filming it from the street. I felt sick thinking about her boys seeing news vans outside their home. Detective Chen called to check on me and told me Donovan had lawyered up immediately. He wasn't talking to investigators, but his attorney had already started spinning a narrative. They were claiming this was consensual polyamory, that all 3 wives had known about each other and participated willingly. It was a desperate lie, but Detective Chen warned me it might get traction in the media. She was right. By Tuesday morning, Donovan's attorney had given a press conference calling this a private lifestyle choice being criminalized by the state. He portrayed Donovan as a progressive man in an alternative relationship structure being persecuted for his choices. It was masterful manipulation, and it made my blood boil. Caroline, Natalie, and I had an emergency call with Marcus Reeves, our attorney. He told us we needed to prepare for this to get ugly. That Donovan's defense would try to paint us as vindictive ex-lovers rather than victims of systematic fraud. But then, something unexpected happened. Evelyn held a press conference of her own. Donovan's 75-year-old grandmother stood in front of cameras and told the truth. She explained how she'd discovered her grandson's crimes, how she'd helped Caroline's investigation, how she'd warned me with that envelope of cash. She called Donovan a predator and said she'd raised him better than this, but had failed to see the warning signs until it was too late. Her testimony was devastating because she had nothing to gain from it. She was elderly, clearly heartbroken, and was turning on her own family member to protect his victims. The media narrative shifted overnight. Wednesday morning, Detective Gordon, the financial crimes specialist, called to tell me they'd finished analyzing Donovan's financial records. The depth of the fraud was staggering. He'd stolen over $600,000 from the 3 of us combined over the years. He'd opened credit cards, taken out loans, even mortgaged properties using forged documents with our signatures. My trust fund that my grandfather had set up for me, which should have had nearly $300,000 in it, down to $18,000. Caroline's savings from her nursing career, gone. Natalie's daughter's college fund, completely drained. But Gordon told me there was a silver lining. Because Donovan had used fraud to access our money, and because they had evidence of his systematic theft, we might be able to recover some of it. The FBI had frozen all of Donovan's accounts and assets. The house in Boulder, the BMW, even his expensive watch collection. All of it was subject to asset forfeiture. That same day, the medical board held an emergency hearing and permanently revoked Donovan's license to practice medicine. The malpractice issues they'd previously warned him about, combined with the criminal charges, made him unsuitable to treat patients. His medical career, which had been mostly fictional anyway, was officially over. Thursday afternoon, Caroline called me. She'd been contacted by 2 other women who'd seen the news coverage. One had been engaged to Donovan 15 years ago before he'd suddenly disappeared without explanation. The other had dated him in medical school and had discovered he'd stolen money from her before she'd broken things off. The pattern went back decades. We hadn't been his first victims. We'd just been the most successful execution of a scam he'd been perfecting for his entire adult life. Detective Chen told us these women's testimonies would help establish a pattern of behavior that would strengthen the prosecution's case. But more importantly, it helped Caroline, Natalie, and me understand something crucial. This wasn't our fault. Donovan had been doing this long before us and likely would have continued long after if Evelyn hadn't intervened. Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Donovan's arrest, I made myself go back to the Cherry Creek house for the first time. I needed my remaining possessions, my photographs, the physical pieces of my life that I'd left behind. The house felt like a crime scene. Everything looked the same. The furniture we'd picked out together, the wedding photos on the mantel, the coffee mug Donovan had used that last morning before everything changed. But it was all hollow now, a stage set for a performance that had been interrupted mid-show. I went through the house methodically, packing boxes with my books, my photography equipment, my clothes. In Donovan's home office, investigators had already removed his computer and files, but I found things they'd missed. A second phone hidden in his desk drawer, a folder of documents with yet another variation of his name, more insurance paperwork I'd never seen before. I called Detective Chen and told her what I'd found. She said she'd send someone to collect it, then asked if I was okay being there alone. I told her I was fine, but I wasn't. The house felt haunted by the ghost of a marriage that had never been real. In the bedroom, I started packing my jewelry and found something that made me sit down hard on the bed. In the back of Donovan's nightstand drawer, hidden under some papers, were 3 different wedding rings: Caroline's, Natalie's, and a 4th ring I didn't recognize. He'd kept them like trophies. 3 rings from 3 current wives and 1 from someone before us. 4 women he'd married, made promises to, and betrayed. I photographed the rings and sent the picture to Detective Chen, then to Caroline and Natalie. Caroline called immediately, her voice thick with emotion. She asked why he would keep them. What kind of person collected evidence of their own crimes like souvenirs? I didn't have an answer. Nothing about Donovan made sense anymore. Or maybe it made perfect sense if you accepted that he wasn't like us, that his brain worked in ways that normal people couldn't comprehend. That evening, Marcus Reeves called with news about Donovan's bail hearing. The prosecution had argued he was a flight risk given the exit strategy files and research on leaving the country. The judge had agreed and set bail at $2 million. Donovan couldn't make bail. His assets were frozen. His family had disowned him after Evelyn's press conference, and no bail bondsman would take the risk. He was going to stay in jail until the trial. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe. He was locked up. He couldn't hurt us, couldn't manipulate us, couldn't smile that cold smile and pretend he had everything under control. Saturday afternoon, the 3 of us, Caroline, Natalie, and I, met in person at a coffee shop in downtown Denver. It was the first time we'd been together outside of police stations and lawyers' offices. We sat in a corner booth, and for a long time, nobody spoke. Then Natalie started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of hysterical laughter that comes when you don't know whether to laugh or cry. She said it was absurd that we were having coffee together, 3 women who'd been married to the same man, trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives from the ruins he'd left. Caroline joined in, and then I did too, and for a few minutes we just laughed at the absolute insanity of our situation. The other people in the coffee shop probably thought we were crazy, but in that moment, we needed it. We needed to release some of the tension we'd been carrying. When the laughter subsided, Caroline said something that surprised me. She said she was grateful for us, that if she had to go through something this horrible, she was glad she wasn't going through it alone. Natalie agreed, and so did I. We'd been brought together by betrayal, but we were staying together by choice. We'd formed an unlikely alliance. 3 women who should have been enemies, but had become something like friends instead. Caroline told us that she'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She encouraged both of us to do the same, saying that the sessions were helping her process not just what Donovan had done, but why she'd been vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. Natalie admitted she was struggling with trusting anyone. She said her daughter kept asking when Dad was coming home, and she didn't know how to explain that the man her daughter had loved wasn't real, that he'd been playing a role the whole time. I shared that I'd been having nightmares, dreaming that I was still living in that house, still married to Donovan, and waking up convinced that everything from the past 2 weeks had been a dream. The relief when I realized it was real, that I'd escaped, was overwhelming every time. We talked about the trial that was coming, about having to testify and face Donovan in court. Marcus had warned us that his defense attorney would try to discredit us, would paint us as unstable or vindictive. We needed to be prepared for our entire lives to be examined and our choices questioned. But we also talked about what came after. Caroline wanted to sell the Boulder house and move somewhere fresh, maybe take the boys to her sister's place in Oregon for a while. Natalie was considering going back to school, maybe becoming a dental hygienist instructor. I was thinking about reviving my photography career, maybe focusing on documentary work. We'd all put our lives on hold for Donovan, made ourselves smaller to fit into his world. Now we had the chance to figure out who we actually were without him. As we were leaving the coffee shop, Natalie said something that stuck with me. She said that Donovan had tried to erase us, to make us into interchangeable parts in his elaborate machine. But he'd failed because we'd found each other and we'd fought back. We weren't just his victims. We were survivors who'd exposed him, who'd made sure he'd face consequences, who'd prevented him from hurting anyone else. That night, I slept through for the first time in 2 weeks. No nightmares, no waking up in a panic. Just sleep. On Sunday morning, I woke up to a text from Detective Chen. The FBI had finished their investigation into the life insurance policies and the exit strategy research. They'd found enough evidence to add attempted fraud and possibly attempted murder charges to Donovan's case. The prosecutor believed they could prove Donovan had been planning to stage accidents to kill at least one of us, possibly all three, to collect the insurance money and disappear. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The research, the timing of the policy increases, the financial desperation as his lies were starting to collapse. If convicted on all charges, Donovan could face decades in prison. I forwarded the text to Caroline and Natalie. Caroline responded with a simple message. Good. Natalie sent back, he'll finally face consequences. And I added, he underestimated all of us. Because that was Donovan's biggest mistake. He thought we were weak, that we'd never discover the truth, and that even if we did, we'd be too ashamed or too broken to fight back. He'd been wrong on all counts. The trial began on a cold morning in late February, 3 months after Donovan's arrest. I stood outside the courthouse with Caroline and Natalie, watching news vans set up their equipment and reporters practice their segments. This case had captured national attention. The surgeon with 3 wives and a possible murder plot made for irresistible headlines. Marcus Reeves met us at the courthouse steps and walked us through what to expect. The prosecution was being handled by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a woman with a reputation for dismantling white-collar criminals. She'd built her case methodically, and Marcus said she was confident about a conviction. But Donovan's attorney, Richard Castellano, was equally formidable. He'd built a career defending the indefensible, and he'd already shown his strategy in pretrial motions. Paint Donovan as a man with unconventional relationship choices, being persecuted by bitter ex-partners, and an overzealous justice system. Walking into that courtroom was surreal. I hadn't seen Donovan since that moment in the parking lot when he'd smiled at me from the back of the police car. Now he sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking thinner than I remembered, but still carrying that air of confidence that had fooled so many people for so long. When his eyes found mine across the courtroom, there was no smile this time, just cold calculation, like he was trying to figure out which angle would work, which manipulation might still save him. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Ada Walsh laid out the timeline of Donovan's crimes with precision: 3 marriages overlapping for years, systematic financial fraud totaling over $600,000, falsified documents, expired medical licenses, and research into staging fatal accidents. She presented it not as a relationship gone wrong, but as a calculated criminal enterprise. Castellano's opening was smooth and sympathetic. He portrayed Donovan as a man who'd made unconventional choices, who'd been honest with everyone involved about his lifestyle, and who was now being vilified because society wasn't ready to accept alternative relationship structures. He claimed we'd all known about each other and had participated willingly until jealousy and financial disputes turned us vindictive. It was a masterful lie, delivered with conviction, and I watched some jurors' expressions shift to uncertainty. That's when I understood how dangerous Donovan's defense really was. The prosecution called witnesses methodically. Detective Chen testified about the investigation, about finding the exit strategy files and the insurance policies. Detective Gordon walked the jury through the financial fraud, showing charts and documents that proved systematic theft. Agent Morrison from the FBI explained the pattern of behavior that suggested escalation toward violence. Then Evelyn took the stand. Donovan's grandmother walked slowly to the witness box, looking every one of her 75 years. When she was sworn in, she looked directly at her grandson and said she was sorry, but she couldn't protect him from the consequences of his choices anymore. Her testimony was powerful because it came from someone who loved Donovan, who'd raised him, who had everything to lose by turning on him. She described finding the phones, confronting him, realizing the scope of his deception. She explained why she'd helped us escape, why she'd chosen to protect his victims over her own grandson. Castellano tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggesting she'd been manipulated by us, that her age made her confused. But Evelyn held firm. She told the jury that she knew her grandson better than anyone, and she knew when he was lying because she'd been watching him lie his entire life. When the prosecution called me to testify, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the witness box to steady them. Ada Walsh walked me through my relationship with Donovan, from how we'd met to the day Evelyn appeared at my door with the envelope. I told the jury about the 6 years I'd spent believing I was in a real marriage. I described the isolation, the financial manipulation, the way Donovan had slowly taken control of every aspect of my life. I explained how he'd discouraged me from working, from maintaining friendships, from staying close to my family. Then Ada Walsh asked me to look at Donovan and describe what I felt now. I turned and looked at the man I'd been married to, the man I'd shared a bed with, the man I'd planned to have children with. I told the jury I felt nothing, that the person I'd loved had never existed, that Donovan was a construct, a performance, a collection of lies wrapped in an expensive suit. The real person sitting at that defense table was a stranger I'd never known. Castellano's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint me as naive, as someone who'd willingly ignored red flags because I enjoyed the lifestyle Donovan provided. He suggested I'd known about the other wives and had participated in the arrangement until I'd gotten bored or jealous. But I'd prepared for this with Marcus. I stayed calm and answered each accusation clearly. When Castellano suggested I'd been complicit in the financial fraud, I pulled out my phone and showed the court the banking app that I'd been locked out of for years, the accounts I couldn't access because Donovan had changed all the passwords. When he implied I'd known about Caroline and Natalie, I asked him to explain why I'd never met them until after Donovan's arrest, why there were no photos of us together, why not a single person in my life had ever mentioned them. His strategy fell apart under specifics. It was one thing to make broad accusations about alternative lifestyles and willing participants. It was another to explain away the mountain of evidence showing systematic deception and fraud. Caroline testified next, and her testimony hit even harder because of the children involved. She described watching Donovan play with their sons, help with homework, attend school events, all while maintaining 2 other families and researching ways to stage fatal accidents. She told the jury about the life insurance policy Donovan had insisted she get last year, about how he'd been so specific about the amount and the beneficiary. She explained that when she'd questioned why they needed so much coverage, he'd told her it was to protect the boy's future if anything happened to her. The jury's faces changed during her testimony. Several looked at Donovan with open disgust. The narrative of consensual polyamory was impossible to maintain when confronted with the reality of 2 children who'd been living with a father planning to eliminate their mother. Natalie's testimony focused on the financial devastation. She showed the jury her daughter's college fund statements, how it had been systematically drained by someone with access she'd never authorized. She explained how she'd been a single mother barely making ends meet when Donovan had swept in playing the role of rescuer, only to steal everything she'd worked for. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, financial records, testimony from investigators, statements from all 3 wives, and Evelyn's insider knowledge of Donovan's patterns. Castellano's defense was thin. He called character witnesses who testified that Donovan had been a good doctor, a charming colleague, a seemingly devoted family man. But under cross-examination, Ada Walsh got each of them to admit they'd had no idea about his multiple marriages, his financial crimes, or his expired medical license. Donovan didn't testify. His attorney had clearly advised against it, knowing that Ada Walsh would destroy him on cross-examination. The closing arguments came down to competing narratives. Castellano made one last attempt to portray this as a private matter blown out of proportion by vindictive women and an aggressive justice system. He asked the jury to consider whether Donovan's choices, however unconventional, really warranted criminal prosecution. Ada Walsh's closing was surgical. She walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, showing how each element proved not alternative lifestyle choices, but calculated criminal behavior. She reminded them of the insurance policies, the research on staging accidents, the financial fraud, the expired medical license. Then she asked them to consider what would have happened if Evelyn hadn't intervened, if we hadn't discovered the truth. She asked them to think about those 2 little boys in Boulder who might have lost their mother, about Natalie's daughter who might have lost hers, about me potentially becoming another mysterious accident statistic. She told the jury that Donovan had built a house of lies so elaborate that it required criminal behavior at every level to maintain. And when that house started to crumble, he'd begun researching the most permanent solution possible. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Caroline, Natalie, and I waited together in a conference room Marcus had reserved, unable to eat, barely sleeping, constantly refreshing our phones for any news. On the 3rd day, we got the call. The jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom and took our seats. Donovan stood as the jury forewoman was asked if they'd reached a verdict. She said they had. Guilty on all counts: bigamy, wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The attempted murder charges had been reduced to conspiracy due to the circumstantial nature of the evidence, but the convictions still stood. I watched Donovan's face as each guilty verdict was read. The confidence finally cracked. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened, and for the first time, he looked like what he was: a criminal facing consequences. The judge set sentencing for 4 weeks later and remanded Donovan back into custody. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he turned one last time to look at us. There was no smile this time, no calculation, just the dawning realization that he'd finally lost control. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Caroline, Natalie, and I had prepared a joint statement with Marcus's help. We took turns reading it, our voices steady despite the cameras and microphones thrust in our faces. We talked about the importance of believing victims, about recognizing the signs of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. We thanked Evelyn for her courage in protecting us over her own family. We announced that we were starting a foundation to help victims of bigamy and domestic fraud, funded by the settlement we'd be receiving from Donovan's seized assets. But what I said at the end was the most important part. I looked directly into the cameras and spoke to anyone who might be living in a situation like ours, who might have that nagging feeling that something wasn't right, that the person they loved might be lying. I told them to trust their instincts, to ask questions, to look at financial records, to demand transparency, because predators like Donovan relied on our silence, our shame, our unwillingness to believe we could be fooled. I said that being deceived didn't make us stupid. It made us human. And fighting back didn't make us vindictive. It made us survivors. The sentencing hearing was shorter than the trial, but no less intense. Donovan stood before Judge Margaret Holloway as she reviewed his case with the expression of barely concealed contempt. She'd read every document, heard every witness, and seen through every manipulation. Judge Holloway sentenced Donovan to 12 years in federal prison for the fraud and bigamy charges, with an additional 6 years for the conspiracy charges, to be served consecutively. 18 years total. She also ordered him to pay full restitution to all 3 of us, plus penalties and court costs. She told Donovan that his crimes represented a profound betrayal of trust that struck at the foundation of civil society. She said that his calculated deception, financial exploitation, and potential plans for violence demonstrated a complete lack of empathy or remorse that warranted the maximum sentence allowed by law. Donovan tried to speak before being led away, to make some final statement, but Judge Holloway cut him off. She said he'd had years to tell the truth and had chosen deception at every turn. His time for talking was over. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom for the last time, Donovan looked older than his 41 years. The confident surgeon who'd juggled 3 lives with apparent ease was gone, replaced by a man in an orange jumpsuit facing nearly 2 decades in prison. I felt no satisfaction watching him go. No triumph, no revenge, no closure, just a quiet relief that it was finally over. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive. We'd become a national story. 3 women who'd banded together to expose a predator with the help of his own grandmother. Producers were already reaching out about documentaries and book deals. We declined them all. This wasn't a story we wanted to profit from or relive more than necessary, but we did agree to one interview with a journalist who'd been covering domestic fraud cases for years. We wanted to use the platform to talk about the foundation we were starting, to turn our experience into something that might help others. During that interview, Caroline said something that surprised me. She said that despite everything Donovan had done, despite the betrayal and the trauma, she was grateful for one thing: meeting Natalie and me. She said we'd become real friends, that we'd built something genuine from the ruins of Donovan's lies. Natalie agreed. She talked about how isolated she'd felt as a single mother, how Donovan had seemed like the answer to her prayers, but had actually been another burden. But finding us, building this alliance, had shown her what real support looked like. I told the interviewer that the hardest part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was accepting that I'd spent 6 years of my life living in a fiction. But Caroline and Natalie had helped me understand that the time wasn't wasted. It taught me things about myself, about resilience, about the importance of trusting my instincts. The settlement from Donovan's seized assets wasn't huge once divided 3 ways and used to pay our legal fees, but it was enough. Caroline moved to Oregon with her boys and started nursing school to finish the degree she'd abandoned years ago. Her sons were in therapy, working through the trauma of losing the father they'd known, but they were adjusting. Natalie opened a small dental practice in partnership with another hygienist, something she'd dreamed of for years but never thought possible. Her daughter was thriving, and Natalie had started dating again. Slowly, carefully, but with the knowledge that she deserved honesty and respect. I moved back to California and reconnected with my family. My parents and I had a series of difficult but necessary conversations about why I'd been so easy to isolate, about the distance between us that Donovan had exploited. We were rebuilding our relationship, and it felt more authentic than it ever had before. I also revived my photography career, but with a different focus. I started documenting survivors of domestic fraud, creating portraits and collecting stories for a project I called The House of Lies. Each photograph captured someone who'd survived systematic deception and come out the other side stronger. Caroline, Natalie, and I were 3 of those portraits. The foundation we started with Evelyn's help became more successful than we'd imagined. We provided resources for victims of bigamy and domestic fraud, legal referrals, financial assistance, therapy connections, emergency housing. We'd helped over 50 people in the first year alone, including 2 other victims of Donovan who came forward after the trial. Evelyn remained involved with the foundation until she passed away peacefully at 80 years old, 2 years after the trial. She'd spent her final years trying to atone for not seeing Donovan's true nature sooner, helping other families avoid the same tragedy. At her funeral, Caroline, Natalie, and I spoke about how she'd saved our lives with her courage and honesty. We'd kept the envelope she'd given me that day, the $25,000 that had been my escape fund. We'd used it as the seed money for the foundation, and we'd named it the Evelyn Hayes Foundation in her honor. Sometimes people ask me if I've forgiven Donovan. The answer is complicated. I don't carry active hatred for him anymore because that would give him power over my present life. But forgiveness implies that what he did was somehow forgivable, and I'm not sure it is. What he did was build elaborate lies that consumed years of our lives. He stole our money, our time, our trust, and potentially would have taken our lives if Evelyn hadn't intervened. That's not something you forgive. It's something you survive. 3 years after the trial, I was in a coffee shop editing photos when I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Jenna, the medical student who'd been dating Donovan when he was arrested. She'd graduated, completed her residency, and was now a practicing physician. She'd called to tell me she'd just made a donation to the foundation and to thank me for potentially saving her life. She said she'd been so close to marrying Donovan, to becoming the 4th official wife. She'd been researching wedding venues when news of his arrest broke. She'd gone to therapy for 2 years to process how thoroughly she'd been deceived and to understand why she'd been vulnerable to his manipulation. Now she was happily married to someone who valued honesty and transparency. She had a daughter of her own. And she wanted me to know that our decision to fight back, to expose Donovan rather than quietly walking away, had changed the trajectory of her entire life. After we hung up, I sat in that coffee shop and cried. Not sad tears, but tears of release. Because that's what this whole nightmare had ultimately been about, stopping a predator before he could hurt anyone else. Last month, Caroline called to tell me Donovan had sent her a letter from prison. She hadn't opened it, and she wasn't going to. She said nothing he could write would change anything, add anything, or heal anything. She'd moved on, and he no longer had the power to intrude into her life, even through correspondence. She'd sent the letter back marked "Return to Sender" without reading it. Natalie did the same when she received one. So did I. We'd given Donovan 6 years of my life, 9 years of Caroline's, and 4 years of Natalie's. We'd given him our trust, our money, our futures. We weren't giving him anything more. People sometimes ask what they should learn from our story. I tell them it's not about paranoia or assuming everyone is lying. It's about trusting yourself when something feels wrong. It's about asking questions and demanding transparency. It's about understanding that isolation is a red flag, that controlling behavior is a warning sign, that anyone who discourages you from having your own friends, your own money, or your own life is dangerous. But mostly, I tell them this: if you find yourself in a situation like ours, you're not alone. There are resources, there are people who've survived similar experiences, and there is life after betrayal. Caroline, Natalie, and I are proof of that. We still meet up every few months, the three of us. We have coffee or dinner, catch up on our lives, share pictures of Caroline's boys and Natalie's daughter. We laugh about things that would have seemed impossible to laugh about 3 years ago. Last week, we met at the same coffee shop where we'd first sat together after the arrest. Caroline showed us photos from her nursing school graduation. Natalie announced she was engaged to a man who knew everything about her past and loved her anyway. I shared that I'd been commissioned to create a photography exhibition about survival and resilience. As we were leaving, a young woman approached our table nervously. She said she'd recognized us from news coverage years ago. She told us she'd been living with suspicions about her own husband, had been afraid to investigate, afraid to know the truth. But seeing our story had given her courage to check his financial records, to ask questions, to demand honesty. She'd discovered he'd been maintaining a relationship with another woman for 3 years. She'd left him, filed for divorce, and rebuilt her life. She thanked us for being public about our experience, for showing that it was possible to survive and thrive after that kind of betrayal. After she left, the three of us sat in silence for a moment. Then Caroline said what we were all thinking, that this was why we'd agreed to share our story despite the embarrassment and pain. Because somewhere, someone else needed to hear it. Someone else needed to know they could survive. 5 minutes. That's all it had taken for Evelyn to change my life that Thursday afternoon, when she appeared at my door with an envelope full of cash and a terrible truth. 5 minutes to destroy 6 years of lies. But those 5 minutes gave me back my future. They gave Caroline and Natalie theirs too. And if sharing what happened in those 5 minutes helps even one more person escape their own house of lies, then every difficult moment of exposure and testimony was worth it. I'm not grateful for what Donovan did to us. I'll never be grateful for the betrayal, or the trauma, or the years of therapy it took to trust again. But I am grateful for the women I met because of it. I'm grateful for Caroline's strength, and Natalie's resilience, and Evelyn's courage. I'm grateful for the foundation we built, and the people we've helped. I'm grateful that I learned who I really was when everything false was stripped away. Today, I'm standing in my own apartment in San Francisco, looking at the city lights and thinking about how far I've come from that terrified woman who opened a door expecting a package and got the truth instead. My name is Sloan. I'm a photographer, a survivor, and a friend to 2 extraordinary women who share a history with me that no one else could understand. I was married to a predator for 6 years, and it took 5 minutes for that world to collapse. But it took 3 years to build something better from the ruins. And that's the story I want you to remember. Not the betrayal, the rebuilding, not the lies, the truth, not the destruction, the survival. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, thank you for listening to my story. If you found something here that resonates with your own experience, I hope you'll find the courage to ask the questions you're afraid to ask. I hope you'll trust your instincts. And I hope you'll remember that there's life after betrayal. I want to hear from you. Wherever you are in the world, leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. It helps to know this story is reaching people everywhere who might need to hear it. And if you want to follow more stories like mine, stories of survival and strength, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss them. because we all deserve to know we're not alone. From all three of us, Caroline, Natalie, and me, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, 5 minutes can change everything, but what you do with the rest of your time is up to you. Choose truth. Choose strength. Choose yourself.